Good afternoon. For our oral group research presentation, we will be discussing instrumental individuals and associations pertaining to the civil rights movement.
Hello, my name is Candace White. My individual is Malcolm X, and my association is Plessy versus Ferguson.
Hello, my name is Hunter Kaler, and I will be informing you of Daisy Bates and her activist work, as well as the events of the Greensboro sit-ins.
Hey guys, my name is Asher Kane, and I will be teaching you about Bobby Seale as well as the SNCC.
Malcolm Little was born in Nebraska on May 19th of 1925. He is the son of Louise and Earl Little. He was the fourth of 8 children. Malcolm's dad Earl was a Baptist preacher and was known to be very outspoken about racism. The KKK targeted him and his family, which caused them to relocate twice before Malcolm was 4 years old. Earl was assassinated on September 28th of 1931. After Malcolm's father died, Louise had a nervous breakdown and was admitted to a mental health hospital to seek treatment. This resulted in Malcolm and his siblings being placed into the foster care system separately. When Malcolm was 21, he got into quite a bit of legal trouble, causing him to have to serve prison time for burglary. He served 7 years of what was supposed to be 10 years. While he was in prison, he became involved with the Nation of Islam. Eventually, he became one of their top leaders and most well-known spokespeople. The member rate increased from 500 to 30,000 in the year of 1936. Years later, after finding out that other higher-up members of the Nation of Islam were involved in promiscuous activity, he decided to terminate his relationship with them and then began the Muslim Monique Incorporation of his own. Malcolm considered his last name to be a slave name, which is why he chose the X to signify and represent the rejection of his birth name. Malcolm X was a religious civil rights leader who believed that equal rights should be attained by any means necessary, which he was very well known for stating in his speeches. He advocated for the black and white separation of Americans and rejected integration. Another civil rights leader during this time was Martin Luther King Jr., most popularly known for his I Have a Dream speech. Although Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were both very powerful and intelligent people, they only met once. Their main difference was that Martin Luther King was noted for kindness and nonviolence, while Malcolm X made statements in his speeches stating that, "I'm for violence if nonviolence means we continue to postpone a solution to the American black man's problem." Another quote from another speech was, "Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, and respect everyone, but if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery." Malcolm X. He was assassinated on February 21st of 1965 by 3 men who were confirmed members of the NOI. Plessy versus Ferguson. In the year of 1890, there was a law passed in Louisiana that restricted black and white Americans from riding in the same train car together. The law stated that equal but separate coaches for white and black passengers were required. In 1892, a man named Homer Plessy, who identified as 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African blood, took a vacant seat on a whites-only car and was arrested. He was identified as black by the state. He was then convicted in New Orleans for breaking the 1890 law, so he filed a petition against Judge John H. Ferguson. He stated that the 1820 law did not follow the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship to all people who are born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of all the laws. Refusing to follow the 1820 law could result in a fine of $25 or 20 days of jail. May 18th of 1896 is when the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson was held at the Supreme Court. The court ruled that the 14th Amendment did not apply to social rights such as choosing to sit in the car of your choice, and only to political and civil rights such as voting. The Supreme Court justified that the law was constitutional based on separate but equal. In 1954, Plessy was overturned by Brown v. Board of Education.
Daisy Lee Gadsden Bates was born on November 11th, 1914, in Huttig, Arkansas. At 3 years old, her mother was sexually assaulted and murdered by 3 white men. To make matters worse, her father also disappeared, so she was left to be raised in a foster home. Due to the tragedy in her childhood, a fire grew in her heart to fight racism. Daisy married a journalist named Lucius Christopher Bates and moved to Little Rock, Arkansas, where they supported each other to fight for civil rights. She became a civil rights activist, writer, and publisher. Together, Daisy and her husband ran a weekly African-American newspaper called the Arkansas Weekly. Daisy felt she wanted to contribute more to the civil rights movement, so she joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and in 1952 was elected president of the Arkansas chapter. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled to desegregate schools due to the trial of Brown v. Board of Education. With this, Daisy made educating the African-American community her main focus. Daisy began assembling students from all over the state to integrate into white schools. Many of the all-white schools refused the African-American students, so she took this to her medium, the newspaper, and exposed the schools who did not listen to the ruling. In 1957, she began the movement of integrating 9 African-American students into Central High School in Little Rock. This movement was soon to be called the Little Rock Nine. At the time, Central High School was all white and not approving of integration, however had no choice. Daisy took it upon herself to drive the students to the school and join the parents' organization to protect the students from violence. During the time, she was advised by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to carry on with a nonviolent course of action because the world is watching and they have expectations. Due to Daisy's heavy involvement with integrating the students, she was targeted and with violence and threats. Although her integration movement was successful, with heavy threats and lack of funding, she was forced to shut down the newspaper. Daisy continued her work in civil rights activism when she moved to Washington, D.C. While working for the Democratic National Committee and for President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, she worked anti-poverty projects. In 1962, Daisy Bates published her triumphs and defeats in a book titled The Long Shadow of Little Rock. With this, she was invited to speak at the March on Washington in 1963. She sat on the stage alongside several men and only few women. Impressively, she was the only woman permitted to give a speech. 2 years later, in 1965, she moved back to Arkansas, where she continued to be active in her community until her death on November 4th, 1999. The Greensboro sit-ins began on the evening of February 1st, 1960 at Woolworth Store on Elm Street in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 African-American students attending North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University by the names of Azell A. Blair, Franklin E. McCain, Joseph A. McNeil, and David L. Richmond sat at a lunch counter rather than abiding by current society standards and standing at the designated location for African Americans. At this time, only white people were served at seating, and African Americans had to be served at a stand-up counter. The Greensboro Four took this courageous step to end specifically lunch counter discrimination, however managed to take a large step into the movement of desegregation. Rather than calling the police or taking aggressive action, the manager chose to shut down the counter the men were at. The business was very cautious about how they handled the Greensboro Four's nonviolent action due to the amount of business the African American community brought to the Woolworth store. Due to the non-aggressive approach to stop the demonstration, support grew rapidly. Across the region and other eating places, sit-ins occurred with about 70,000 participants in total. These acts were successful, not only in integrating lunch counters. They proved that nonviolent direct action is effective. The sit-ins brought attention nationally through different mediums and brought awareness to the community to a problem needing solving. Just 4 years later, Congress made it illegal to have segregation in public places with the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Robert George Seale, also known as Bobby, was born on October 22, 1936 in Dallas, Texas. Bobby was born to George and Thelma Seale and was the oldest of 3 children. Bobby and his family moved around quite often. The family bounced around from Dallas to San Antonio to Port Arthur and finally settled in Berkeley, California. While in Berkeley, Bobby attended high school, and in high school, Bobby began to form a political consciousness. He began to question the knowledge he learned in regards to Native American history and the African continent. Bobby dropped out of high school in 1955, right before he graduated, and joined the Air Force. Bobby served 4 years before being dishonorably discharged for bad conduct in 1959. After being discharged, Bobby enrolled in Merritt College in California, where he met Huey P. Newton. Huey and Bobby became political confidants, and in October of 1966, the two founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense. The Black Panther Party practiced militant self-defense of minority communities against the U.S. government and fought to establish revolutionary socialism through mass organizing and community-based programs. The party was one of the first organizations in U.S. history to militantly struggle for ethnic minority and working-class emancipation. The Black Panther Party reflected Malcolm X's philosophy of self-defense, which is by any means. The Black Panthers started out in Oakland, and over time it spread worldwide. In 1968, Bobby and 7 other protesters, also known as the Chicago Eight, were charged with conspiring to incite a riot at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Bobby's conviction ended with him being sentenced to 4 years in prison on the charges of contempt. The charge was overturned the following year. In 1970, Bobby was then tried for killing a member of the Black Panthers. After 6 months at trial, it ended with a hung jury. After the trial, the Black Power movement subsided. Even though the Black Power subsided, to this day, Bobby remains politically active by speaking out at college campuses and other venues. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as the SNCC, commenced 2.5 months after the Greensboro sit-in. The weekend of April 15th through 17th, student sit-in leaders gathered at Shaw College in Raleigh, North Carolina. Their mission was to meet one another, share experiences, and to discuss coordinating future actions. Ella Baker, one of the great figures in the 20th century civil rights struggle, had organized the gathering. She was then executive director of Reverend Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As the sit-ins unfolded, Ella noticed that beyond energetic protest, the students were bringing something fresh and new to the civil rights struggle. And at the Shaw University Conference, Ella encouraged these students to consider forming their own organizations. Thus, the Student Nonviolent Committee was born. The SNCC's emergence as a force in the civil rights movement came largely through the involvement of students in the freedom rides. In 1961, the SNCC's field secretaries, Charles Sherrod and Cordell Reagan, arrived in Albany. Their mission was to test a 1960 Supreme Court ruling that declared segregation in interstate travel facilities unconstitutional. By the time the Interstate Commerce Commission began enforcing the ruling, mandating equal treatment in interstate travel in November 1961, the SNCC was already immersed in voter registration efforts in Macomb, Mississippi, as well as a desegregation campaign in Albany, which became known as the Albany Movement. The Albany Movement formed on November 17, 1961 by the SNCC. The movement produced the largest direct action campaign since the bus boycotts in Montgomery, Alabama. The SNCC also played a huge role in the Atlantic Project. The Atlanta Project aimed to increase Black community control over the public decisions in which their lives are affected. The Atlanta Project was very effective and caused a lot of uprise. The project lasted until 1969, but in 1970, the SNCC had lost all of its 130 or so employees and most of its branches. Finally, in December 1973, the SNCC ceased to exist as an organization. The civil rights movement took place during 1954 to 1968. The nonviolent protests, motivation, and inspiration ultimately led to the campaign ending up successfully and earning African Americans the right to take part in politics, as well as becoming less discriminated and less mistreated. Unfortunately, the world is still inherently unequal, so that the people's promise of true equality remains unfulfilled. However, it is this notion that movements can and will change the world we live, and that's what makes the legacy of the civil rights movement so important. So here are some questions to think upon. How can these tales of resistance and of mobilization for change inform the way that we move toward a more equitable world? What are the struggles that still exist? These are the questions that we hope this resource will raise in the classroom, where students, as they begin to own this history, become agents of change in their own lives and the world in which they live. I really hope you all enjoyed our presentation, and I want to thank you for listening.